Kidnapped by the U.S. government. It really happened. The Japanese Latin American story next on Emil Amok's Takeout. And hi everyone, welcome to what I call Emil Amok's Takeout. We serve it, you take it out. It's my takes on all things about race, society, politics, and diversity, and everything those things touch in our culture and society with respect to Asian Americans. And of course, you don't have to be Asian American to lend us your ears. We give them back, not surgically altered or anything, we just give them back to you. I'm Emil Guillermo, your host. Hey, isn't that like Latino or something, you ask? Well, no, I'm Hispanic by colonization only. I'm Filipino, not Latino, so now you know. And this Amok thing, why Amok? Well, the short story is for nearly 15 years, my Emil Amok column was a staple of Asian Week, what was once the leading Asian American weekly in English in America. Amok was the name of my compilation of essays, and Amok is on my driver's license, and that is not a bad Asian driver joke. On this episode, an incredible tale of kidnapping by the U.S. government, and the captors are still alive to tell it. But first, Emil Amok's Take, and it's brought to you by AALDEF, the Asian American Legal Defense and Education Fund blog, AALDEF.org/blog, AALDEF.org/blog. Read all my takes there, and if you like it, donate. AALDEF is a full 501c3 nonprofit. Make your tax-deductible donation there. And now my take on health care. Thank goodness Obamacare is intact for now. It was scary, but the fact is people like it, no matter who they voted for president. I mean, only healthy conservative ideologues hate it, and they couldn't muster enough energy to get rid of it because Donald Trump is an incompetent political leader. I mean, look, he can build high-rises, he can rent out to the rich, but he can't build political coalitions. And you don't need 100 days to learn that. Trump 45 is the least experienced, least qualified person for the presidency. We know that. He's out of his element in the public sector. He's all about profits and corporations, not people. That's really what drove, of course, we can say his ego, but what really drove his willingness to repeal Obamacare was, well, it's about profits and corporations, not people. And also, like I said, he has this really profound hate for Barack Obama. We knew that from the whole birther incident. And we can see more of it this week with the rollback of climate change, where Trump is acting like the big fat man at the trough, undoing his belt. Really, it's incredible what he's doing. But we don't want to talk about coal, not in this episode. We want to talk about health care. Like I said, Trump, we don't need 100 days to know he doesn't understand governing. He doesn't understand democracy. He knows how to be a boss. He knows autocracy. And he was willing to lop off 24 million people from healthcare without even knowing what he's talking about. Of course, Trump's a bad leader, and so is Congressman Paul Ryan, the Speaker of the House. I mean, how can you have control of both houses of Congress and not get a bill through? Is there a leadership problem? Is it possibly the dawning of Republican gridlock? It's really stunning, and we just got to talk about it still, even though it happened last week, because it's just unbelievable that it happened. Look, Obamacare has its problems, But it's not because of its main goal, which is healthcare of all. Or rather, healthcare for all. That goal was not wrong. The problem with Obamacare is that it was a compromise to start. And with the insurers holding all the cards, well, clearly it was profits before people. And that's all the problems. That's the reason we're seeing all the problems with Obamacare. Look, here's your short course in insurance. It's all about pools. The bigger the pool of people, the better. If you got a lousy pool that's too small to cover costs, premiums are going to go higher because you're going to have more sick people than well people. The deductibles are going to be higher. Companies are going to pull out. The key is you need big pools of people. Everyone in. And then you have the risks that are spread out and costs can be maintained. Large pools, big pools, that's what you need. Small pools and everyone's sick. Everyone loses. Now, if everyone's in, the so-called individual mandate, where you have to be in, you've got more people paying, you got more well people paying, and that helps cover the poor people. It's as simple as that. And the replacement plan was calling for an end to the individual mandate. I mean, how is that going to work? But basically, that's how insurance works. Now, the defeat of Trumpcare is just the beginning. Now we need to move forward toward a universal plan, like the universally loved Medicare. That's old person's care for all. That's not Medicaid, which is welfare, essentially. It's that, Medicare is just care for all. And that's the answer. Not Trumpcare, not Ryan-care. In the meantime, it's a good thing we're stuck with Obamacare because it cares for the people. All right, for my other takes, like how I feel about Judge Neil Gorsuch for the Supreme Court, read my piece at the AALDEF blog. That's at aaldef.org/blog. And if you like the things you see there and you want to support the podcast, the broadcast, donate. It's tax deductible. And now for our episode of the day. Most of you know about the Japanese Americans during World War II and how they were interned, wrongly, I might add. Well, there was a subgroup below them who were treated even worse than the Japanese Americans. They were the real foreigners and treated as third-class people. Who were they, Emil? Well, they were the Japanese Latin Americans. Now, how did they get into the internment story? They were kidnapped.
We came together, we were kidnapped together. We were all the time we were together.
86-year-old Art Shibayama knows from history, the family that's kidnapped together stays together. That is, except for his grandparents who partially raised him. They were kidnapped by the U.S. government and then sent to Japan, and Shibayama never saw them again. It's an incredible but true story. Here's how Shibayama describes how the U.S. government during World War II sent transport boats to South America to round up Latin Americans of Japanese descent. Shibayama talked about how his father joined other men in his town in Peru to try to avoid being captured.
Some of the head of the family went into hiding. Okay, now, the police came to our house a few times, again, not finding my father. They took my mother and put her in jail. And one of my sister, who was 11 years old at the time, went with her because she didn't want our mother to go by herself.
And that's the kidnapping.
So then, when my father found out about it, he came out of hiding and gave himself up. And that's how the U.S. government were able to get us over here.
It's not your typical way to get to America and sounds unbelievable, but it's what happened to more than 2,200 Japanese Latin Americans, mostly from Peru, who were allowed by their countries to be taken by the U.S. government during World War II. And the purpose was simple.
For prisoner exchange.
Mm-hmm.
See, my grandparents were using one of the hostage exchanges. So after although they're the one that I kind of grew up with them. I mean, they raised me, part of the time, and so I was really close to them. And so when they took them from Peru, I never saw them again after they left. So that's kind of hurt.
Why were they taken from Peru?
Well, they couldn't use the Japanese American because they'd be exchanged civilian for another civilian. So they figured they're going to get in trouble. And so that's why they went to South American to get us from there and use us for exchange.
So do you feel you were kidnapped by the U.S.?
Yes. I know they did.
What did they do? How did they take you?
They took us. You mean how did we come here?
Yeah, how did they bring you to America? They went to Peru and they kidnapped you?
Yes. And they put us in a U.S. Army transport and they brought us here to the States.
Did they tell you why? Did they tell you why it was being done?
No, because we didn't speak English. They tell us in English. We wouldn't understand anyway. We spoke Spanish back in Peru.
When did you find out what your true purpose was, that you were going to be used to be exchanged for Americans in Japan?
Well, like I said, my grandparents were one of them. They used them for prison exchange. By the time we got kidnapped and put us in just another different Justice Obamacare camp, my grandparents were already in Japan, used for exchange.
Did you ever see your grandparents?
No. So after they left Peru, I never saw them again.
How does that make you feel when you think about that story, that they kidnapped your grandparents?
Very sad. Well, they kidnapped us too. We were all kidnapped. All the Latin American, Japanese.
And to this day, what are you considered? Are you a resident alien, or what is your status?
No. I'm an American already. In 1970, I got a U.S. citizenship.
And so, what are you seeking now? What would make you feel whole? What would be considered justice?
For them to give us the right apology and the right compensation, because they only gave us a quart, one fourth of what the Japanese American received. They offer us 5,000. 19 of us refused that. Refused to take it.
When you look back at the history, what is the worst thing? What are the things that make you upset the most?
Taking us out of Peru and call us illegal aliens. When we were boarded the U.S. ship, our passports and classified documents were confiscated, and then they call us illegal when we landed here.
The stripping of their documents, in fact, left them without a country. Another victim was 86-year-old Blanca Katsura. She was just 12 when her father was taken from Peru. She and her family remember being reunited with him within the year, seeing him thin from being held in a work camp, overworked and underfed. But then they were all together in a U.S. government camp in Crystal City, Texas. That would be their home throughout the war. They were not allowed to return to Peru.
We were told we were Peruvians and yet ousted. And when we wanted to go back to the country that we knew, we were denied re-entry. So we spent 2 years in camp after the war, just named illegal alien and people without a country, actually. Literally, people without a country.
Blanca later became a U.S. citizen by marriage, and even Art Shibayama later was able to become a U.S. citizen. But the injustice perpetrated against him and the other Japanese Latin Americans has never been addressed. It's the reason why Shibayama and his legal team went before the International Commission of Human Rights at the Organization of American States to make the case for all Japanese Americans, or rather Japanese Latin Americans, who were taken from their homes during World War II. Phil Tajitsu Nash is a board member of AALDEF who assisted the legal team. He said understanding why it all happened is simple. The U.S. needed a pool of foreigners, people to trade for U.S. GI hostages held in Japan. Essentially, they were pawns of war.
Yes, and because Japanese Americans were still considered Japanese, there still was a notion that people like my grandfather, who had been born in Japan, he was considered Japanese even though he had been in the United States for over 20 years by the time the war broke out. He had given birth to 5 children who were American citizens. He had paid taxes. He had every intention of staying here. And yet, because his passport still said Japan, and because he read Japanese and wrote Japanese, he was considered to be a Japanese. And I think that's the unfortunate legacy of our laws, particularly before World War II.
Was he susceptible to this? Did he get, somehow brought into this and offered up in some way because of that status?
No, he, in fact, was rounded up with other people. A number of community leaders were rounded up on the night of December 7th and December 8th, 1941. He was not. There were a number of people who were just whisked away. I mean, the families never saw them again. And some of them were allowed to rejoin their families, but some of them were kept in separate camps, aside from the 10 big camps that people know about, like Tule Lake or Minidoka. And it was just a very difficult situation for the Japanese Americans because they were treated like foreigners, even though they were, 2/3 of them were American citizens by birth.
All right, so the United States, to do this hostage capture deal, they needed the supply of foreigners. They couldn't deal with the ones here in America, the Japanese Americans, many of whom they saw as foreigners, but they couldn't deal with them. So they went to Latin America? I mean, for some people, that seems to be kind of a leap, but how did that happen?
Well, we know that before the war, there had been some discussion with the governments of Latin America, and we know that the United States has been involved in foreign policy in Latin America, frankly, overthrowing governments there and getting involved in ways that go beyond the scope of this podcast. But the United States discussed with a number of the countries there ways that they would round up the Japanese nationals, some of whom had become citizens in those countries and some of whom were still foreign nationals. And we're talking about, a number of countries: Bolivia, Colombia, Costa Rica, Dominican Republic, Ecuador, El Salvador, Guatemala, Haiti, Honduras, Mexico, Nicaragua, Panama, and Peru. And other countries like Brazil had their own plans. They didn't cooperate directly with the United States. So there was some concern that these Japanese nationals might be conspiring to, blow up the Panama Canal or do some other nefarious thing. But frankly, they were needed for this hostage exchange. And don't forget, just to clarify, Japanese Americans were considered for hostage exchange because they were Americans but not white Americans. I don't think even the idea of a black or Latino American was discussed as much, but the idea that a white GI from the United States could be exchanged for a Japanese Japanese American or a Japanese Latin American. These were things that were discussed at the highest levels of our United States government.
All right, so the government went to Latin America. They obviously got cooperation if they brought over 2,200 Japanese Latin Americans. But was this secret at all? Was it something that was publicly discussed either in America or in Latin America?
No, not as much. It really wasn't too well known. And don't forget, there were also about 4,000 German nationals, about 200 Italian residents of Latin America. So there was some idea of exchanging those people as well for people in the European theater. This is something that they wanted to do, the United States government wanted to do, and did.
But it wasn't something that was, say, talked about on the news or talked about in public, or there was no public outcry about any of this?
No, today the word we would use is black ops. It's something that just happened and without a lot of public acknowledgement. Now, don't forget, the Japanese Americans were living in California, in Washington State, in Oregon. They were living in places where news outlets were in existence. And when people started getting rounded up and signs started going up saying, we have to sell our farm, we have to sell our car, people knew about it. So the Japanese American removal and incarceration took place in the public sphere. But this operation where U.S. agents would show up in Lima, Peru, for example, and just take away the head of the family. That family knew about it, and people in the Peruvian Japanese community knew about it, but not a lot of other people knew about it, and certainly that news didn't travel up to the United States very much.
Describe a typical way that this would happen. The United States would have these boats that would be docked at Lima or some of these cities in Latin America, and then what would happen?
Well, just in the case of one family I heard about, the father was someone that the U.S. authorities was looking for, so they waited for him, and when they couldn't find him because he had gone into hiding, they took the mother into custody, and the daughter went with her because she didn't want the mother to get raped or otherwise, mistreated. And finally, the father found out about it. He came out. The father was taken away, put on a boat, taken to the United States. His passport and other identity papers were taken away, and he was kept in the United States for the duration of the war. Meanwhile, the mother and other children came on a subsequent boat and also had their identity documents taken and arrived in New Orleans and then came to meet the father in Texas.
And Texas was where the big camp was for these and other Japanese Americans who were incarcerated, or just for the Japanese Latin Americans?
Well, these were Justice Department camps. The other ones were run by the Interior Department. And these Justice Department camps were in a number of places around the country, but this big one in Crystal City, Texas, was the one where a lot of the Japanese Latin Americans were. And
so they were there. And then would they be exchanged? Would they be actually taken and considered to be exchanged for hostage in Japan and then separated from their families?
Well, there were actually only two exchanges that took place. One took place early in the war, and then another one took place later. The first ship left New York City in June of 1942 with 128 Japanese Latin Americans. And then they went down to Rio de Janeiro in Brazil and picked up some more. And the second ship left New York in September of 1943 and had 737 Japanese Latin Americans. Some also were sent after the war because they were deported, and Peru didn't want them. They became stateless people, and that's part of the whole crime of this thing here. With their identity documents taken away in a heartless and frankly illegal and inhumane way, they were rendered stateless, and they were considered illegal immigrants, quote unquote. And so some of them tried to stay in the United States, some of them tried to go to Peru, some of them were sent to Japan. It was just a mess.
But once again, in terms of the original purpose to be exchanged for American GI hostages held in Japan, how many times did that actually happen?
Just those 2 times. And so it's approximately 1,000 people.
So it actually happened. And then, so if you came over as a Japanese Latin American and you weren't in that batch, well, you were kind of lucky, I guess. But as you pointed out, not really, because you were in this strange limbo even after the war.
Yeah, frankly, the illegality and the inhumanity started on the day when someone knocked on the door in Lima, Peru, or any of these other countries and treated this person not as a human being, not as an individual, not as somebody deserving of legal rights, but as somebody who was a pawn in this triangle of hate, somebody who could be just picked up and held and then used as a pawn in this hostage exchange. This person may have been a pacifist. This person may have been a civic leader or business leader in their community. It didn't matter. Their ancestry trumped everything, and they were considered guilty by reason of race.
And we know this happened to Art Shibayama and his family. When I talked to him, he told me about his grandparents first being taken away and actually exchanged. He said they were one of the earlier exchanges.
Yeah, and that is part of the tragedy too, because he had been raised by his grandparents from early age, I think from 1.5 until 5, and he considered them very, very close, like parental figures. So, again, the tragedy happened the minute these people were picked up, and the fear they lived under, the uncertainty, the horrible conditions, the statelessness, these are all factors that happened then, and frankly, they continue up to the present time, because these type of post-traumatic stress situations persist not only in the first generation, but in the second, third, and subsequent generations. And we're going to see a lot of problems going on in the years ahead, because we have millions of refugees who've been sent away from their war-torn countries in the Middle East and other places. And that trauma they're suffering is not going to go away when the wars end.
Now, when I talked to Shibayama, he told me about his grandparents and how he never saw them again. And then he said that he and his family later on were sent to Texas all together. So it's like a generational thing. It's like grandparents, parents, the offspring. It just seemed to me like he was locked into this. What do you want for Shibayama that would make him whole or that would bring him justice?
Well, he and his brothers, speaking on behalf of quite a few of Japanese Latin Americans, they specifically went to this Inter-American Commission on Human Rights looking for 5 basic things. They're looking for a full disclosure of the United States governmental actions that were committed against them and the other 2,200 Japanese Latin Americans during World War II. And nobody really knows. These records are not clear. They've not been made public. They need to be declassified. The second thing is they demand an apology reflecting the severity of these government-sponsored actions. They demand compensation, something equitable, not just what the Japanese Americans got, the $20,000, perhaps more, perhaps something that looks at the businesses that were lost, perhaps looking at the loss of property, perhaps looking at medical expenses, public education that was lost. The fourth thing they're looking for is removal of the word illegal alien from the records of themselves and all other Japanese Latin Americans. It's prevented them from having government-sponsored work. It's done a lot of damage to them over the years. And frankly, you look at the way that we treat quote-unquote illegal aliens now from Spanish-speaking countries and other places, that is the same type of public stigma that these Japanese Latin Americans have suffered with for 70 years. And finally, the Japanese Latin Americans want assurance that comparable violations will never again be perpetrated against them, their families, and any other people. And I think that's going to be one of their longtime legacies, because frankly the Japanese Latin American situation can be applied to some of the situations we're seeing now.
Tell us about the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights, the IACHR, as part of the Organization of American States. And What are they, and what power do they actually have to help out the appeal of Art Shibayama?
The Inter-American Commission on Human Rights is a fact-finding organization. Any signatory to the Organization of American States, which includes basically all the countries of the Western Hemisphere, they have signed on to this commission, and the commission includes people who volunteer to come 7 times a year to meetings, and they talk about various cases that are brought by indigenous people of the hemisphere or by individual people from various countries who oftentimes are complaining about their own country violating their human rights. And so these people get to make their claims, and then the government gets to respond. But in order to limit the jurisdiction, the petitioners have to make certain claims. They have to say, I've exhausted my remedies within my own country. I've tried to go to the court system and did not receive satisfaction. And there's several other things they have to do in order to be able to jump to this international arena. Now, the Shibayamas are able to assert that they exhausted their remedies in the United States because the Japanese-American redress movement happened, and afterwards there were several court cases and several developments that happened so that the Japanese Latin Americans did not receive the justice that they deserved. And they filed their claim with the help of 2 civil rights lawyers, Karen Parker and Paul Mills. Paul was there at the hearing this week on the 21st of March. And so this Inter-American Commission on Human Rights was the proper venue. It took 12 years after the Japanese Latin Americans had proven that they were able to bring their case. They had surmounted all of the procedural barriers. This was in 2006, so that's 11 years. And they were able to finally get a hearing in Washington, D.C. And so the commissioners were there. The defendant, United States government, was not there. And it was noted in the newspaper that day that the United States government was not there in another big case that has been brought by the ACLU that happened right after the Shibayama case in this Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. And it may be a policy of the Trump administration to not honor this Inter-American Commission on Human Rights and not give legitimacy to claims being brought against the government of the United States.
Would the OAS have the power to force the United States to do anything, or as long as the United States is part of this group, it does? What are you saying?
They have the power of the press. They have the power of moral suasion. They will put together their fact findings and make their determinations. And there it is. It'll be up to the government of the United States to agree to accept those findings and give monetary compensation or do whatever else is requested by this commission. But it's not like being at a domestic dispute where if somebody sues you for $100 and they win, then a policeman can come and arrest you if you don't pay that $100.
All right, but we're still in that arena of probable moral victory if it doesn't really have the power to make the United States to do really anything except maybe shame them into recognizing the Japanese Latin Americans.
That is unfortunately true. I'm hoping that the United States government, whoever is in power by the time the decision comes out, that person will accept the findings and help to make these Japanese Latin Americans whole. Now, don't forget that Art is in his late 80s. Other people are in their 90s, or many of them are deceased.
Well, one of the things that I noticed, or that's pretty glaring to people who have been following the history, the Civil Liberties Act of 1988 gave the reparations to Japanese Americans. The Japanese Latin Americans were left out. Or did they get a partial offer or a sub-offer? Were they offered a fraction of what the Japanese Americans were offered?
It's a little bit complicated, but by and large, because many of them were illegal aliens and not citizens of the United States, they did not make it in the first cut. they brought a suit, the Mochizuki case, and as part of the settlement were offered an apology and $5,000, which was 1/4 of what the Japanese Americans were offered. Art and his two brothers decided not to accept that. They wanted full and equal treatment. And that's the case that we currently saw at the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights many years later.
And now, if even with the fact-finding and whatever the OAS comes up with, maybe it goes back to Congress and Congress has to authorize the money again, right? Or come up with something that would make Shibayama and the survivors, because I can't imagine there's many right now, because they're not going to count heirs or, people who were sons and daughters. They'd have to have a new bill attached to make the apology and the new set of reparations.
Yes, if you look back at the Civil Liberties Act, which is the thing that passed in 1988, it had to go through a typical authorization and appropriation process. Ultimately, we had people like Senator Inouye and Senator Matsunaga. We had Representatives Matsui and Mineta. We had strong representation there who pushed for these bills to get it through and then to authorize the $1.2 billion that it took to give $20,000 to each of 60,000 people. And we may or may not have that kind of clout now. We have a lot more Asian American representatives in Congress. We have several senators, but we have a government run by the Trump administration that will not be supportive of a settlement. And who knows what will happen. Let's wait and see what the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights says first.
Yeah, but essentially the government, though, could just wait it out and let their culpability, in a way, die a natural death in the same way that they've kind of waited out on the Filipino veterans of World War II for a long time and that sort of thing, right?
That is true, although the Japanese Latin Americans have already won in the court of public opinion. I think just by coming to Washington, there's been a lot of blog posts about it, a lot of Facebook posts, people talking about it. There has been press down in Brazil. There's been press here. San Jose Mercury News ran a very good piece. The LA Times ran a piece. So people are talking about it. They know that there is information available. There are several books that I can mention if people are interested for more information. So I think that public opinion battle has already been won, and now we need to win this victory at the commission as the next step.
Now, when I talked to Art, he told me about what he endured, and he told me about his situation, and he used the word kidnapped. And that's a shocking word to hear someone, an 86-year-old, say it happened to him, at the hands of the American government. But is it really kidnapping? Do you see it as kidnapping?
I frankly do. I mean, it's the type of thing where we can quibble about the exact legal terminology. It may be different in different jurisdictions, but in point of fact, they were taken from their homes. They were deprived of their property. They were deprived of their liberty, and they were held against their will for many years. And no reasons were given. At the time, people knew something about this hostage exchange, but it wasn't, they honestly didn't know. And I'm not saying that it's exactly like the Jewish situation in World War II, where the death camps were at the end of the line there. But the Japanese Latin Americans suffered in fear for many, many years, not knowing if their families would be torn apart. So I think kidnapping is the appropriate word here.
Well, kidnapping for the purposes of being used as an actual political pawn.
An actual pawn. I mean,
an actual pawn.
In Washington, people use the word a little bit loosely, but in this case, it is factually the correct word.
Yeah. And how about Blanca Katsura? She was a young girl, and her father was taken away. They were reunited in the Texas camp, and both Art and Blanca later became citizens because they, Art through, I think, his service and also marriage, and Blanca through marriage. How about her? Would she be in line to receive something, or is she looking for What kind of justice is she looking for?
Yeah, she came with a delegation to Washington in March to get justice and to support Art and his brothers. She wants what everyone else wants, the things I discussed before, the disclosure, the apology, the compensation, the expungement, and the non-recurrence. But, she wants this to never happen again to anybody else. I mean, I think that is the prime motivator for everyone.
Now, you've mentioned that before and now, and I guess the thing that makes it relevant, or that struck me, is that we're in a time now when the United States is involved in this different kind of war, where it involves many countries and different ethnicities and different nationalities, and the idea of a prison exchange is not uncommon. We have Guantanamo, we have prisoners, and in this new war on terror is a situation that happened to the Japanese Latin Americans. Is it something that is something that could happen again?
Well, it is happening again. We hear the word rendition being used. Basically, the United States government says, we found this fighter on the battlefields in country X. We picked them up and we took them down to Guantanamo. And that's all they'll say. They don't say, what the person's name is, exactly what they're charged with, and we just have to believe them. Many things are being done in secret. Many things are being done under the guise of national security. At the time, in the 1940s, the word was military necessity. And if you read a book by Michi Weglin called Years of Infamy, she talks about that notion of military necessity and how it was used as a fig leaf to hide governmental misconduct. How Franklin Delano Roosevelt and his administration did things to the Japanese Americans that violated the Constitution. And so when I hear the government of the United States today doing things against supposed radicals from the Middle East, it's all kinds of terminology that's used to make us think, oh, okay, go ahead and do it to them. I worry because there's not as much oversight as I would like. They say, oh, there are special courts that have been set up to look at this in private, but frankly, when you look back at these things in history, you see that these type of renditions, these type of actions don't always add up. So I'm hoping that we as Americans will learn from what happened to the Japanese Latin Americans and make sure that we don't just lock up people or mistreat them because of their race or their religion or other characteristic that they can't change.
Well, you're asking the OAS for this non-recurrence. There's a non-recurrence clause. Would it have much force on the U.S. government so that they would make sure it never happens again? Or once again, are we in that, idealistic, arena where, well, maybe the U.S. will or maybe it won't?
Well, in the Anglo-American jurisprudential system, we tend to use money damages in a way that has some force. When something happens, your arm gets cut off, we can't put your arm back on, but we will give you money to compensate for that. I think that when we give money to these Japanese Latin Americans and say, we're sorry this happened and here's X amount of money, it vaccinates a future generation against this type of recurrence, because people will look at it and say, not only did we do the wrong thing to Japanese Latin Americans, but we as American taxpayers had to pay for that. And oftentimes by paying for it, it's painful, but it means that people take it more seriously. So I think it will be important to give these Japanese Latin Americans an apology, some type of monetary redress, maybe set up some type of educational foundation to get things in the textbooks, and then have some type of governmental acknowledgement that we should not do this again to any people.
And when do you expect to hear from the OAS next? When would you hear their finding?
Well, they have no timetable, and it took many years to move from the procedural issues to the merits of the case. But based on the hearing that took place on March 21st, the commissioners were very, very supportive. In fact, they were asking questions that you can interpret as wanting to elicit more facts that would be supportive of the Japanese Latin Americans. And my guess as a lawyer who's looked at trials and looked at hearings over many years, I think we're going to get something positive in terms of a verdict. And my hope is that they will come out quickly and use this as an opportunity to speak to the Trump administration and to the military-industrial complex in this country and say, hey, you still have to follow the Constitution. You are controlled by a civilian government. And it's very important that we have a military, but it's also very important that we, the public, understand what they're doing and approve of what they're doing.
Now, many of these people who are seeking justice, like Art Shibayama and Blanca Katsura, they're American citizens, but they're also in their 80s. What happens if they die before anything is resolved?
Well, under the Civil Liberties Act, people who had passed away before the date that it was signed in 1988 did not receive redress. So obviously half of the people who suffered did not get redress. There was one 107-year-old gentleman who was the first one who got a check, and we joked at the time that, why did the guy have to live to be 107 to get redress? So I was telling Art and Blanca at the hearing, well, I hope you don't have to live to be 107 to get redress. But I think they can be satisfied that they have achieved some justice in the eyes of the public and they've vaccinated a new generation. I'm hoping that the commission will come down with a ruling fairly soon, and I'm very hopeful that they will be alive to receive their payments and to see the disclosure, the apology, the expungement, the non-recurrence, all these things happen.
All right, Phil, I appreciate your time and your knowledge on this, and you're fighting for Art and Blanca. I mean, I talked to Art for the first time. I've heard about his story, but it's shocking to think about this, and I think it must be shocking every time you mention this to people who've never heard, because isn't it surprising that most Americans don't know this story?
Well, it is shocking and sad, and I think it is good that we're having this discussion today, and it's good that the word is getting out. Frankly, if people want to learn more about this, they should go to the Japanese Peruvian Oral History Project website and find out about it. They also can get in touch with the Campaign for Justice, a woman named Grace Shimizu, who's been the leading advocate there for many years. She is at jlacampaign@gmail.com, and just Google Japanese Peruvian Oral History Project and you can find more books and articles about their campaign.
Phil Tajitsu Nash, a professor of University of Maryland, a civil rights activist and lawyer, and a person who played a role in gaining redress for Japanese Americans interned during World War II. Now he's seeking the same for Japanese Latin Americans like Art Shibayama and Blanca Katsura. A decision is pending before the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights at the Organization of American States. It's Shibayama et al. Versus USA, Case 12.545. And now you know. Hard to believe the U.S. went to a foreign country to kidnap essentially foreigners so they can trade them for GIs held hostage in Japan during World War II. But that's what happened, and the U.S. wrongly felt fully justified. But I'm sure after hearing from Shibayama and Katsura, we should learn the lesson. Human rights must not be compromised in the name of military necessity or national security. Period. Not then, not now, not ever. And that's our program. Hey, we're on iTunes. Please subscribe, rate, and review. It's on iTunes. Hey, just go to your phone, that little purple thing, that icon on your phone, if you like our show. And I thank you very much. It'll help people find us and listen to the same content that you've enjoyed today. Hey, you can contact me on Twitter at Emil Amok, or go to the AALDEF blog at www.aldef.org/blog. Give us your feedback, and if you want to support us in our endeavors here, AALDEF is a nonprofit, a 501c3. Go to the blog, make a donation. There's a little red button there. It's fully tax deductible, and it will keep us going. You can also go to my personal site at www.amok.com. Hey, we haven't done this yet, but we could include your voice in the mix. If you want us to play your comment, or if you want to say something about anything you've heard today or in the past, give us a voicemail, 888-580-6069, 888-580-6069. So that's it for us this time. Thanks again for listening to Emil Amok's Takeout. I'm Emil Guillermo.